Hi, Sasha. Hi.
Hi.
Managed to get this working. Hi, everyone. My name's Josie. I'm one of the gut health dietitians, and I'm joined with Sasha. So, Sasha is a dietitian as well, but co-founder of Field Doctor. Yeah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi Josie. Yeah, I'm a registered dietitian with a particular interest in the area of irritable bowel syndrome and worked a lot with the low FODMAP diet. And then, yeah, we make some meals over at Field Doctor that are focused specifically on the low FODMAP diet and for the elimination stage of the diet. But really interested to chat today about the reintroduction stage of this diet because I think it's something people often skip. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, a bit of an introduction to Sasha. Thanks for joining. But the reason why we're here is part of our social calendar for IBS Awareness Month, April. So we've already done a few sessions as well with Phil, so Sasha, and with other dietitians at the Gut Health Clinic. So you can find those over on Instagram, so on the Gut Health Clinic page, but also on Field Doctor as well. So today we're looking at the reintroduction phase, which is phase 2 of the low FODMAP diet, but we've already done sort of other previous IG lives as well, looking at sort of the earlier phases of the low FODMAP diet. So do feel free to check those out if you haven't already. So yeah, I guess we can get things started. And so I should really introduce myself. So I'm a dietitian at the Gut Health Clinic. My name's Josie. I work with functional gut disorders, so things like IBS, of course, but also bloating, constipation, and other factors that sort of impact the gut or conditions. But also, I help people with their weight, disordered eating, women's health, so things like fertility and all sorts of other things, so things like PCOS. So a bit of a mixed bag. So that's Gut Health Clinic. So yeah, should we get started?
Yeah, so we had a couple of questions sent in. So if I can fire them across to you as the clinical expert to answer all these frequently asked questions around the reintroduction stage. So I guess key question is, what is the reintroduction stage of the low FODMAP diet? I haven't even premised this with, I don't know, maybe we should do a quick intro to what the low FODMAP diet is if people haven't come across it yet.
Yeah, so for anyone that hasn't already caught up with the previous videos or hasn't done their own research, the low FODMAP diet basically is to help people with their gut symptom management. So for those that have been diagnosed with IBS, we do sometimes use it in other gut conditions, so things like IBD, help manage gut symptoms. But yeah, it's been created really for IBS management, so irritable bowel syndrome. And the diet is made up of 3 phases. So phase 1 would be low FODMAP diet. So FODMAP is an acronym that stands for different short chain carbohydrates that are poorly digested and readily fermented. So this can lead to changes in gut symptoms. So it can lead to the production of gas, so things like bloating, excess wind, and that gas can then sort of push on sensors in our guts, which can lead to things like pain and discomfort. And also we can have extra fluid drawn into the gut. So we might have things like like sort of diarrhea, sorry, but also we see constipation as well. So a range of gut symptoms is sort of what we see. So FODMAP, we reduce these foods that are readily fermented. Then what can happen is we get more symptom management. So that's phase 1, is limiting those sort of trigger foods. And these are mostly plant-based foods, but we also get them in lactose, but we'll touch on those later. So some dairy foods, not all. And then phase 2, once we've done that, have symptom resolution. Phase 2 is looking at challenging these foods so that we can reintroduce these according to our tolerances. So in a stepwise approach, we would start to reintroduce these different FODMAP foods. So we would increase them gradually, so a small amount on day 1, a bit more on the second day, and then more on the third day, and so forth. So there's a whole structured approach, which we'll touch on more later. Then following this, so following phase 2, once you've done the challenges and you know more about your tolerances, you would then have a personalized diet. So you would start to eat in a way in according to your tolerances. So really trying to liberalize your intake of FODMAP foods, as they are very nutritious, which I'm sure we'll go on to as well. So it's a 3-phase diet, and it's to help people with IBS management and of course to maximize other areas of their health as well. So reintroduction is super important with this diet.
Yeah, why should you reintroduce these FODMAPs? Because often when you've met someone who's started on the low FODMAP diet, they've taken out these foods that are triggers for their symptoms. They feel so much better. it sort of feels counterintuitive to be bringing back in foods that give you symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see this all the time in clinic. You know, people have been on the low FODMAP diet for, you know, a long time. Where actually phase one, the strict low FODMAP diet, should only be followed for up to 8 weeks. And that's really to reduce any sort of risk. And with that, where the risk can come from and why we should reintroduce, we can split that really into two different factors. So you can think of your physical health. So if you're restricting FODMAPs, so you're doing phase one diet for a long period of time, what you might be doing is limiting your intake of certain nutrients. So things like fiber, for example, really good for our gut health, can even help with things like cholesterol, stabilizing blood sugars, and all sorts. And also prebiotics. So these are basically fibers that are proven to have a health benefit for us. So these are, you know, found in lots of FODMAP foods. And also even things like calcium. So if you're restricting lactose, then actually you might be struggling to get your calcium in as well. And that can have an impact to your physical health too. So, you know, your teeth, your bones. So it's really important that we're not restricting these foods unnecessarily, and we're bringing these back into tolerance to really maximize health. But also touching on the prebiotics again, you know, with a missing fiber, prebiotics, polyphenols, so the chemicals we find in plant-based foods, which help with our gut health. If we're limiting these foods, then we might be reducing the diversity of our gut microbiome. And we know that our gut microbiome and having a diverse range of microbes in our guts is really important for our overall health, from things like our immune function to our mood, metabolism, hormones, and all sorts. So we really want to protect that as much as possible. And with any sort of restricted diet, emotional well-being is really important too. So not just physical health, but emotional well-being. If we're restricting foods for a long period of time, you know, that might lead to disorders, sort of habits around these foods. With any sort of elimination diet, if there's a lot of restriction, it might lead to things like binging. It might lead to sort of anxiety around food, fear around food. That can impact quality of life. But also, if we're restricting and we're not having these fibrous foods, but we might have gut symptoms worse. So we really want to not be doing it for too long, because it might actually end up making our symptoms even worse, even when it's meant to be helping. So many reasons, but you can think of it as physical health and sort of emotional well-being. That's how I like to think of it. And that's why it's
Wow, that was a fantastically comprehensive answer. So what does the reintroduction stage of the diet look like? What is it made up of?
Yeah, so the reintroduction phase should really be a structured phase. So it's a stepwise approach. And what we would do is we would start to challenge each one of those FODMAP groups. So what you would do is you would choose one FODMAP and FODMAP-rich food that represents really that whole FODMAP group. So for example, if it was fructose, you might reintroduce honey or mango, and you'd reintroduce that, over 3 days. So on day one, you'd have a small amount of that food. So it might be something like a quarter of a mango, for example. Then day two, if you had 24 hours symptom-free, you'd move on to day two, and that's when you would increase that. So maybe something like half a mango. And then again, if you were fine with that for 24 hours, you would go on to day three, which would be the final day of the challenge, where you'd have slightly more food, more of that food. So it might be something like 3/4 of a mango or a whole mango, for example. And that's really just to allow you to know how much of that food you tolerate, because you might tolerate maybe a quarter of a mango, but you might not tolerate half mango. But that can still help you. That might mean you can still have a small amount of that food. So it's a stepwise approach where you introduce one high FODMAP food that represents that whole FODMAP group, which I'm sure we'll go on to discuss. And then what you can do is, if you know you can tolerate a quarter of a mango, you can probably, of course, tolerate some honey as well, so a small amount of honey or other fructose-rich foods. So that's how you do it, and that phase can take sort of around 6 to 10 weeks, depending on really your sort of starting point and what foods you want to reintroduce, and sort of your baseline diet before you follow the low FODMAP diet. So it can take longer than that. So that's what it looks like. So it might take a week to basically do one FODMAP challenge, so one of those foods. And what you would do after that 3-day challenge, where you gradually reintroduce, you'd have a 3-day washout period, and that's just to let your gut rest, so that you can get back to that sort of baseline that you had in phase one with gut symptoms. So you're avoiding any sort of loading of FODMAPs as well, which might sort of cloud your results and your symptom response.
Yeah, loading is also, some people may refer to it as stacking.
Mm.
So you mentioned the process for each challenge, 3 days on, 3 days gut rest. How many challenges are there? What are the foods that you are challenging with?
Yeah, and if you're doing the full low FODMAP diet, so some people might be advised to start a modified low FODMAP diet for whatever reason, but I won't touch on that. But if you're doing the full low FODMAP diet, it's likely that you'll do around sort of six, if not more, reintroduction. So ideally more, because we have five main FODMAP groups. So fructose, lactose, polyols, but within that there's two polyols that we would test for, so sorbitol and mannitol. So we're already on four. And then there's GOS, so galacto-oligosaccharides, and then there's fructan. So kind of six overarching FODMAPs. But within that, so for fructans in particular, there's lots of different high FODMAP foods that are rich in fructan. So vegetables, fruits, and also grains. So with fructans, we normally recommend that people challenge a few of those so they get a better idea of their response, because we may find someone responds differently to pasta, which is predominantly fructans, differently to maybe bread, for example, even, which has a little bit of GOS in as well. So there are some foods that have more than one FODMAP. So for fructans in particular, we do normally say to test a few. So normally garlic, onion, and then a grain product is typically what we suggest. So it may go up to 9 or even more. It really depends on what people want to test, and it's really a personalized approach, but at least 6 we would say.
And is there a particular order in which you do these challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, personalized really. It depends what people are quite eager to get back in, but it is important to note that you are following a low FODMAP diet throughout the whole reintroduction phase. So even if you were really keen to reintroduce garlic, and you found you had tolerated that, in the next FODMAP challenge, you still need to not have that garlic, because it might mean you're stacking those FODMAP. So, there's not always a need to do your favorite food first if you're still going to have to wait to have that food. So it's really personalized, but I often say for people not to do fructans first, as that can take quite a long time, and that might make it a bit more confusing for people. So doing something like fructose might be a bit easier to start off with. So it's really to people's preferences, but I guess it's sort of making people aware that you still can't have your favorite food throughout the whole of the reintroduction phase, and that might change how people want to reintroduce really.
And how long should the process take, assuming it all goes to plan?
Yeah, so if it all goes to plan, so if it doesn't go to plan and say you react within 24 hours, we would normally say to do a 3-day washout. So if you're doing that, it might take a bit longer. But if it all goes smoothly, then around sort of 6 to 10 weeks, depending on how many challenges you do, because it might take around sort of 6 days to finish a whole challenge and a washout period. And also for some people, 3 days might not actually be enough. So some people might find they want to do a washout period for 4 days or 5 days, depending on sort of how they responded to a food, and in between sort of challenges as well. So it's really not one size fits all, but I guess from sort of 6 weeks is a realistic amount of time, and likely longer.
Okay, so what happens? You're on day 1 and you're trying fructans in wheat. That's your challenge. You react on day 1. What happens then?
So yeah, if you react on day 1, I think it's really important to think about like the amount that you've had. So double check that it's like an amber serve. So for anyone that's followed the low FODMAP diet, we normally do it like a traffic light system. So amber would be sort of moderate amount of FODMAPs. So just check on day 1 that you haven't gone right up to an amber serve, a really high FODMAP serve. Check in with things like anything else that's going on in your life. So it might be, for example, if on that day you've had more than usual, or you've had a very stressful conversation with a colleague. So thinking about all the other things that might be impacting eating. And if there isn't anything else that you can think of, so maybe stress, any other irritants like caffeine, fatty food, spicy food, alcohol, and also even, if you're chewing food quite quickly that day for whatever reason, other things that might be clouding your response to that food. So thinking of those things and retracing your steps. And it's really important, to be actually monitoring that. So monitoring the amount you're having, checking that with, your dietitian that you're working with, or any sort of resources to check that that's the right amount for that day. checking that everything else has been constant and there's nothing else clouding it, and also checking the severity of symptoms. So a bad reaction for one person actually might not be that bad for someone else. You know, a little bit of bloating, a little bit of gas might be quite tolerable and might be okay. But for some people, you know, a bad reaction, you know, actually might be something like nausea, diarrhea, like urgency to go to the toilet. So it's sort of questioning all of those things, really. But yes, if you have a bad reaction, I'd say retrace your steps. Is there anything else that might be, any other variables that might be impacting that response? And then if you did react, having that 3-day washout, which might even be longer for some people, and then carry the next challenge. So, and bearing in mind that you responded one way to, you know, say fructans, like you said, during that challenge, in future, maybe in a few months' time, you might find that you could try that again, so re-challenge it, and you might find your response is different as well.
Yeah, so how often should you keep trying to re-challenge with that food? Or is it, oh my gosh, I've had a reaction, I should never eat it again?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's slightly personalized really as well. But if you had a really bad reaction, I think there's no need to keep reintroducing it and putting your gut under more stress. It might create more fear around that food as well, whether you sort of notice that or not. So I would say giving it a good break. You should maybe reintroduce other foods, and then later down the line in a few months' time, you could maybe look at reintroducing that food and see how you get on with that.
Yeah, and I've found in the past in my clinical practice that it helps when you're doing that next reintroduction to go back with a smaller amount that had the reaction to, because it might be you want to even just half that dose, and maybe that will be tolerable, and then keep reducing it every time you try it, because maybe there'll just be a small amount that you can tolerate, and I think over time that can help improve the toleration if you're at least sort of keeping it in your diet a little bit. I don't know what your view is on
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. And, you know, for anyone doing a reintroduction, some of the foods, actually, the portions are fairly large compared to the other ones in the reintroduction, aren't they? So you might find actually the amount maybe on an amber serve might actually be bigger than what you'd normally have. So definitely you might find actually an even smaller amount that you can test with. So that's where working with a dietitian can be quite helpful. But yeah, certainly sometimes you can take a more pragmatic approach. You might sort of think of, actually that's more than I would normally use for day one. So maybe you could make it a bit smaller next time. And, you know, if that didn't go as planned the first time, maybe if you did have some reactions. So like you say, yeah, personalizing that, you can make it a bit smaller. You know, particularly if you're quite desperate to try and tolerate that food. So that is one thing. Yeah, definitely. I agree.
And we've sort of touched a little bit on this fear of food and anxiety. Of course, you're about to challenge with a food that you know has triggered some symptoms in the past, and there's a lot of fear and anxiety around that. Could that fear and anxiety in itself be driving symptoms during that challenge process? And how do you manage that?
Yeah. So definitely, I think it's really important to be thinking about stress levels. So we know that IBS itself is, you know, it's a disorder of the gut-brain axis. You know, we're learning more about that and how, yeah, the gut-brain axis itself. We know how our mood can impact our gut and vice versa. So, yeah, I think it's really important to be making a note of even stress levels as well as severity of symptoms. And this is what we sometimes call a nocebo effect. So if the stress of reintroducing, perhaps in phase one, you've had really good symptom relief, you know, you're getting that quality of life back, that stress of reintroducing can sometimes be triggering and changing that response, that organic response that you would have had without the stress. So yeah, definitely worth sort of thinking about stress management. So there's lots of different things that you can do, sort of focusing on your breathing, so breathing techniques, sort of focusing on breathing out, sort of rest and digest, things like yoga, going for some light exercise, and sometimes just planning ahead a little bit and actually being prepared. So if you're doing the reintroduction, sort of looking at the amounts. Sometimes people realize, like, you know, for garlic, for example, it's a really small amount of garlic that you start off with. Sometimes just seeing it and realizing actually that's much smaller than I thought it would be, that can sometimes be reassuring for some people. And just being aware that there is a relationship between mood and your gut can also help as well. It might make you feel a bit more sort of positive about sort of going forward about how to manage that, and, you know, realizing there are other tools that you can use to manage your stress throughout as well.
And you mentioned the nocebo response, and obviously this, you know, fear, or this fear of this reaction coming. In the past, I've had a client who, you know, thought garlic was her key trigger and did do a challenge with garlic, but was incredibly stressed and very fearful of it, had a response, and it was quite difficult to work out whether it was the garlic or whether it was the stress or anxiety levels. So she actually asked her husband to give her a blind challenge. We use the word blind challenge, obviously, within a research context, but he dropped the portion of garlic into a meal that he was cooking at some stage without her knowing, and she didn't have a reaction to that meal. Is that something that you would recommend? I mean, obviously you don't want your partner to be, you know, running these challenges for you, but perhaps if you've kept trying again and again and again, and you're not sure about what, you know, what's at play and what factor is coming into play, maybe it's useful. I thought it was an interesting story to share.
Yeah, that's really useful. Yeah, sorry, I would have mentioned that. That's a good point. So certainly, if there is any anxiety around food, yeah, getting a partner, getting a friend to maybe pop it in one of your meals for the day, and just see how you respond. Just making sure they're keeping note of where the food was and how much as well. But yeah, that's such a good idea. Doing the blinded approach, and that can take some anxiety out of it, hopefully as well. And then see if it was an organic response with your gut as opposed to sort of your brain. Yeah, really, really good approach to take as well.
And is there anything else that could have caused that negative reaction? So, not to sort of lead into this question, but I was sitting talking to some people last night about their reintroduction process. And one of them sort of mentioned that she's having an issue with fruits and vegetables, and that she keeps trying to reintroduce them time and time again, but has terrible symptoms. Is there something else in the fruit and vegetables that might be causing an issue, having been on a very sort of, you know, low FODMAP, low fiber diet? Is there something that might be coming with those fruit and vegetables that might be causing the symptoms?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So with fruit in particular, it's high in the FODMAP fructose, so a natural fruit sugar. And actually too much fructose for anyone can cause issues, whether sort of you have IBS or not. So particularly with fruits, so we sort of say this around FODMAP stacking as well. But with fruit in particular, if you're having too much, particularly too soon, so maybe having like a fruit salad after a meal, for example, with lots of different fruit in there, or you know, having lots as a snack, whatever it might be. If you're having a lot in one go, then yeah, that might be quite a lot on your gut, and that might lead to sort of changes in symptoms. So definitely with things like fruit in particular, some practical advice might be sort of limiting it to sort of 2 pieces a day and spacing it out as well, so not having lots in one go. So allowing some time for that fruit to go through your gut before you move on to have a next one, to avoid sort of stacking of that fructose in there. So yeah, with fruit in particular, that's quite a unique one where actually we might say generally to sort of try and space that out and limit the total amount that you have in the day.
And I was also wondering whether fiber could be a factor, because obviously there are some low FODMAP fibers that are absolutely suitable, but I know a lot of people that follow the low FODMAP diet and are on that elimination stage, actually they're having a very low fiber intake. You
Yeah.
know, when starting to bring back some of that fruit and vegetable, perhaps the fiber might be causing a bit of an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because if you remain on the low FODMAP diet for a long time, perhaps if you're unsupervised or you're self-medicating, whatever, you might find, eventually you actually get constipation. So particularly if you're IBS-C, so constipation predominant, staying on a low FODMAP diet, which is essentially stripping some of the fiber back, particularly if you're not taking it as well, that can definitely worsen some symptoms for some people. But then when we reintroduce, because you've lower fiber diet in phase 1, so the strict low FODMAP diet, reducing for some people might be a bit troublesome, particularly if you've got quite a sensitive gut. So reintroducing slowly help, and that might not be as obvious even in reintroducing phase, but perhaps the personalization phase, really as much as possible. So yeah, one of the best things to do really is bear that in mind, really. But it's really important to get the fiber back in. But if you are struggling, taking that sort of stepwise approach with reintroducing fiber as a whole as well, so increasing things gradually, and that can help with tolerance and avoiding sort of gut issues or any discomfort that might happen when we increase too much fiber too quickly.
Yeah, and we know that fiber affects everybody's gut. So, if you're having a huge fiber intake from having starting at a very low baseline, it's going to give you symptoms whether you have IBS or not. So, why is it that there are so many people that don't realize that they need to reintroduce FODMAPs? Because it seems like a very clear process, but a lot of people remove it, and then I find that they've been on the elimination diet for maybe 2, 3 years, not the 8 weeks that you recommended, and they haven't reintroduced FODMAPs.
Yeah, and I think there's probably multiple reasons for that. I think, even on the internet, there's a lot of misinformation. Perhaps, you've spoken to your GP, maybe a dietitian available at the time to do the diet with you. And perhaps you found yourself on a forum online and someone's sort of told you to follow a diet and the proper detail around the different phases and the justification for reintroducing as well. Because if you were maybe, your GP, they asked you to follow a low FODMAP diet without a sort of referral to a dietitian, which unfortunately is quite common. And perhaps that's just because they don't have that training or they don't have the resources. So dietitians are not always available as in primary care, so at GP level. And there might be on the waiting list. So people, if they're having symptoms that are really bothersome, it's impacting their quality of life, being able to socialise and work and things. They're going to start self-medicating. And, information online is at everyone's fingertips, isn't it? So it's easy to find misinformation online. And then perhaps you followed phase one and think, oh, this is it. I'm much better now. And you just forget to check, what's the next step. So it's not that obvious, I guess, because if you're feeling better with phase one, you might forget that actually it's really important for your overall health and, long-term symptom management to be increasing those FODMAPs back into tolerance.
So you mentioned stacking as a term. I don't know if you want to define that or expand a little bit on what stacking is.
Yeah, so FODMAP stacking can make the reintroduction process quite confusing for some people. So essentially what FODMAP stacking is it's having maybe lots of different low FODMAP foods, which when put together, maybe eaten in a meal or a short period of time, even something like 12 to 24 hours, having lots of different low FODMAP foods together can lead to a higher FODMAP load. So that's what FODMAP stacking is. So if you think about food, it takes, 12, 24 hours, sometimes longer for some people, for food to travel from our mouth to the end of our digestive tract, so, to our anus. So actually, the amount of time that food takes, it's possible that FODMAPs can stack together. So that's what FODMAP stacking is. So even if you have lots of low FODMAP foods that you tolerate, or FODMAP foods that you tolerate, when you're putting them together with other FODMAPs, they can sort of mix and that load can become higher. And that might lead to, changes in your gut symptoms.
And I'm guessing a really useful tool to have when you're doing these challenges is to have a food and symptom diary or a challenge diary to note down symptoms. But how soon after you've eaten the meal would you expect to have symptoms? Because I've heard sometimes people say, I ate this challenge food in this meal. And I've suddenly had a reaction within half an hour of eating it. Was it that challenge food or could it have been something else?
If it's happening that quickly, within, an hour, it's unlikely to be the food. So if you think about how long it takes for food to leave, your stomach, that alone can take longer than an hour. So it's unlikely to be the food itself, at least from that meal anyway. It could be maybe the meal before, if that wasn't your first meal of the day, or it might again be that gut-brain axis at play. So if you're feeling quite stressed, it might be other elements going on that are triggering that symptom. So that's where, like you say, monitoring is really important. So, what happened before that, building a bit of a picture and doing some investigation work. Was it that meal? How long is, the time after sort of the trigger? Did you eat something before? Did you drink something before? All of these things, building up a bigger picture and sort of investigating that. But yeah, definitely, we wouldn't say it's maybe that FODMAP in that meal if you had it, symptoms 1 hour after or shorter even. So you want to see really for symptom changes within 24 hours, really up to for some people. But yeah, if you think about how long it takes for food to leave your stomach and go into your intestines where the triggers will be happening, where the symptoms will be happening, that can take a few hours alone. So that's something to bear in mind as well.
So you've gone through the reintroduction phase. You've now understood what your triggers are or are not, hopefully. What should your diet look like after the reintroduction phase? You mentioned this sort of third stage of the diet.
So yeah, the third phase is the personalization. And that's really where you've got all of the data from phase two, so your challenges, and that's really where the true reintroduction happens. So we call phase two reintroduction, but really you do most of that in phase three, which is an ongoing process for a lot of people. You might go back to phase sort of two sometimes if you want to re-challenge a food later on in future. But phase three is kind of an ongoing process, and that's where you do the bulk of the reintroducing of food. So that's when you want to start planning. So using that data from phase two, what did you tolerate? What did you not tolerate? What sort of meals can I make from this? What FODMAPs can go together? What meals do I need to maybe space apart? So you start piecing together the bigger picture and planning for your future sort of meals. And even meals as a whole, you might find you want to even do some challenges with meals if there's certain meals that have got a lot of FODMAPs in. So, you know, it's really a never-ending process, I guess, that introduction of food and the challenging of food. But the third phase should really be you getting as many of those foods that you can tolerate, so those FODMAPs in as possible, and liberalizing your diet as much as possible. So getting in that diversity to support your gut health and to get that diverse, range of microbes in your gut. So getting those microbes up in your diet and getting the balance in. So looking for sort of 30 different plant points a week, and that you can get from not just fruits and veg, but also your grains, nuts and seeds, things like olive oil, herbs, which are low FODMAP for the herbs and spices. So thinking of those sort of elements in your diet and getting that diversity back in again and making balanced meals, and really trying to get as diverse a diet as possible and leaving as much restriction of FODMAPs behind. So building a bigger picture, I guess, and some planning can go into that. So looking at what will your meals look like now with your new sort of personalized approach.
And if you want to go back and revisit one of those challenges where you did have a reaction, should you step back into the second phase again and go really low FODMAP before challenging, or can you still try one of those challenges on this new modified diet that you're now following?
So what you can do, so working with a dietitian is one of the best things to do, and I guess it really depends also on your symptom severity. So if you're feeling like you're not having really any gut symptoms at all with your new personalized diet and you want to try a challenge food, then what I would say is to keep your diet as constant as possible. Maybe on a week, if you eat quite a lot of the same meals, just continue to do that. Don't eat out that week or whatever. Try and keep it as constant as possible. Thinking about caffeine, fatty foods, spicy foods, and all of these, and even things like fruits, if you're having lots of fruits that day in particular. So if you're doing that challenge, you could try it depending on your symptoms. If you still feel you get a few symptoms, you might want to do like a washout period before starting, just to see if you relax your gut as much as possible, and then keep things constant still, and then try the re-challenge. So use a smaller amount like you would in phase two, and then building that back up again. And use a pragmatic approach. If like Monash or any resources you're using tell you start with a bigger amount than you're comfortable with, you can always start with a slightly smaller amount.
Brilliant. So if people want to go away and find some more information about how to reintroduce FODMAPs, where should they go?
Yes, so there are lots of good evidence-based places to sort of look at resources online. So great places to start. You can find things on sort of gut health and IBS, of course, on the Gut Health Clinic. You have resources on your website as well, don't you, around IBS and FODMAP diet, so really good. Other resources that you can get are sort of like Monash app. So Monash at university created the low FODMAP diet. There's lots of good resources online, but they also have an app where you can track your progress throughout the low FODMAP phase. So that's really good. If you're looking for a book, there's a book around reintroducing FODMAPs by Lee Martin, also really good, and that's very expensive. That's some really good places to go to get that information.
Fab. Well, that was all my questions. So thanks, Josie.
Great. And I guess before we go, so thank you for your time, Sasha. It was great to have this conversation with you. And I hope someone found that useful. If you have any questions, do let us know and we can get responding to those. And this will be uploaded. But our next session for the IBS Awareness Month is on the 29th of April, I believe, at midday. And that's with our new dietitian, and that's looking at the gut-brain axis. But again, we already have some resources on the Gut Health Clinic page, also Field Doctor as well, if you want to access those in your free time.
That's right. So yeah, next Friday is the Insta Live, but actually next Tuesday evening, we're doing another session together with Anna across over at the Gut Health Clinic, where it's Ask a Dietitian a session on Zoom. So you can submit any questions that you've got to Anna. So I think there's some more information also on your website about that.
Oh yeah, amazing. That'd be great. So yeah, session as well on Tuesday, and then yeah, another IG Live. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoys that. And yeah, it was great to see you, Sasha. And thanks everyone for joining.
Oh, thanks, Josie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.